You ever notice how grief can turn a house into something that feels borrowed, like every chair is waiting for its rightful owner to come back? If you've ever felt your sorrow get reshaped into family arithmetic, then you'll understand why I need to tell you this story. So stay close. Follow along, because what happened in my kitchen that day changed the temperature of my whole life. It was the kind of late morning when sunlight drags itself lazily across the tiles, about 2 weeks after Evelyn's funeral, and the air inside the Charleston house felt one step removed from the place I had known for decades. I was standing at the counter, steam curling from a navy mug chipped at the handle, a Father's Day gift from my granddaughter Maya, when the phone started vibrating across the counter with Caleb's name lighting the screen. My son's voice came steady and clipped. "The way foremen check a clock, we need to talk about the house," he said, rolling out words like they'd been stacked and measured. "Taxes, upkeep, square footage. It isn't practical for you to stay." I set the mug down without drinking. "Good morning to you." "Too," I answered, and the edge in my tone made him breathe sharper. He pressed on, saying they already had a serious buyer, and I could hear it. The faint scrape of a plan walked around and admired long before I was told. I glanced outside, at the rosemary crowding the brick path and the Meyer lemon tree needing a careful prune, and felt, deep in my chest, that I might be the last person alive who still knew how to read this property's handwriting. "There's no mortgage," I said calmly, a fact I'd never flaunted, because peace grows best in silence. "Your mother and I paid it off years ago." He paused, then laughed in that strange way people do when kindness wears the mask of calculation. "Dad, please." Mom's pension barely covered her prescriptions. "We know you're under strain." In my mind, I could see him at his dining table, a spreadsheet glowing like a lantern. Dad's house. Offer. Proceeds. Split. I'd taught him to make change from $1 when he was 8, and now here he was, balancing the man who'd taught him. "Are you worried about me?" I asked. "Or about what you could do with the money?" He muttered something about practicality, which is just control in its Sunday best. I ended the call before he could package my life into bullet points. The phone lit again, almost before the screen could dim. Jenna, my daughter-in-law, speaking with the bright precision of a ribbon tied around a box. "Caleb and I think you'd be happier in our finished basement," she began. "Your own entrance, a full bath. We could add a kitchenette. Independence, independence, in 4 walls, under someone else's roof." "And the money?" I asked. "Well, after the contractor, you could set some aside, help with Maya's tuition, maybe help Caleb with the new place. Win-win." It had the polish of something rehearsed. "Jenna," I said, "when was the last time you called about something that didn't end with a $sign?" She stumbled, blaming work and the winter, as if excuses could patch the truth. I spared us both. "I need to check on the lemon tree," I said, ending the call with the kind of courtesy that doesn't apologize for being real. I poured the untouched coffee down the sink, the rosemary scent clinging to my hands, pulling me back to afternoons when Evelyn would brush soil from her palms and declare, fresh from the source, as though the garden itself was an act of faith. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was Claire, my daughter upstate, with the voice of someone who starts every call mid-meeting. She warmed me with small talk about the school play and the weather before steering, gently but inevitably. To her point, a senior condo near her, with shuttles, amenities, community dinners where I'd never feel alone. Her hope was almost convincing, until she said, "We can roll the proceeds into an annuity." "You don't say. We like that by accident." "Who's we?" I asked. "Caleb and I," she replied, and I could see them across a table, passing my life back and forth like a condiment. I told her I've always preferred to pay for my own heat. She said she only wanted what was best. For whom? I asked, and let the quiet do the math. When the house finally settled, I walked into Evelyn's study, where the afternoon light slanted soft across her reading chair, the air smelling faintly of lemon oil and lavender. The clock on her desk ticked without hurry. A bottom drawer, stubborn as always, gave way to layers of old life: tax returns, appliance manuals, cards with handwriting more precious now than gold, and at the bottom, a pale blue folder I'd never seen. I didn't open it, not yet. Not because I feared its contents, but because, for the first time since losing her, I felt the pull of a direction, and I wanted to stand in it a little longer, breathing the light before taking the next step. By early afternoon, the house had stopped pretending to be mine, and I decided I was done pretending to be available. I took the pale blue folder from Evelyn's desk and set it back down, unopened, the way you place a compass on a table to remind yourself there's a direction, even if you're not ready to walk it. Then I pulled a legal pad close and drew 3 neat columns: what they know, what they don't, what I can prove. And the act of writing steadied me better than coffee ever has. In the first column, I put the obvious: my age, the funeral, their concern packaged as practicality. In the second, I wrote the truth that hadn't been said out loud. The house paid off years ago. The way I can still climb a ladder and fix a leak. The part of me that refuses to live under anyone's roof by permission. In the third, I added the deed, the tax receipts, the small stack of letters with county stamps that make clerks nod, sometime close to 1. I called Peter Avery, the estate's attorney, who helped us sort a minor inheritance tangle long before anyone thought we'd need him again. And he answered like a man who still trusts names more than caller ID. I told him enough to draw a map, pressures, a serious buyer, talk of basements dressed up as independents, and he said, with that dry, exact calm that made me like him the first time, "Bring what proves the house is yours, and we'll keep it that way." So I slid the deed and our last paid tax bill into a weathered envelope and drove across town while the marsh light did its winter shimmer over the water. Peter's office lives in one of those old brick buildings that used to be a bank and still remembers how to hold confidence. And when he met me in the doorway, he didn't reach for grief with both hands. He said he was sorry in a voice that understood sorry is not a lever, and led me to a walnut table that had learned to outlast arguments. I laid out the papers, and he read, like a carpenter measures, quick but square, then leaned back and spoke in sentences that didn't need to raise their voices. No one can list so much as your garden hose without your agency. Any agency you did grant can be revoked by a letter that knows where to land, and we will send both. Cease all solicitation. Notice of non-representation. Today, he asked whether anyone had tried the word that turns care into custody, and I said it had been floated, which is how threats test their weight, and he said to keep my phone, my memory, and my handwriting close, because judges prefer facts to feelings and recordings to recollections. He told me to freeze my credit, not as an accusation, he added, as insulation, and to funnel all future conversations about the property through him, no exceptions, somewhere after 2, while the winter sun sat low and uncommitted. His assistant came in with drafts already printed, the kind of paper you can feel doing work, and I signed with a steady hand I hadn't felt since we chose the casket. We set a simple strategy. Any realtor or buyer hears from Peter. Any letter gets logged. Any call about the house happens with the red light on. He said one more thing at the door, almost as an aside, but friendly in its precision. When you're tired, they will sound reasonable. Make decisions in the morning. I drove home in that hour when light goes pewter and porches turn their lamps on, and the phone kept trying to be the lead character. Texts that began with my name like a claim. A voicemail from Caleb saying he didn't want this to be combative. A message from Jenna offering to drop by with dinner, as if soup could close county records. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because silence is sometimes the only breathable air. In the kitchen, I placed Peter's copies in the bottom drawer of my desk. My drawer now, not Evelyn's, and wrote 3 lines on the legal pad like a pledge I could keep even in the dark. I choose my clock. I choose my counsel. I keep my keys. Toward evening, the house settled back into the kind of quiet that knows the difference between empty and claimed, and I walked the rooms the way a man checks his fences after a storm, touching the chair Evelyn loved, straightening the lighthouse magnet that holds Maya's bright crayon garden to the fridge, breathing the rosemary on my hands until memory softened its edges. The blue folder waited on the study desk, patient as tide, and I let it wait one more night, because the lesson Evelyn taught me long before she left was simple as a plumb line. Do the next right thing in the order it deserves. Tomorrow, I would open what she left. But today, I had done the work that lets a man sleep under his own roof without asking anyone's permission to dream. Toward mid-morning, when the light found its soft angle on the desk, and the house felt almost willing to listen, I opened the pale blue folder the way you lift the lid on something that could change your day. On top were ordinary layers of our life. Warranties, tax receipts, a postcard I'd forgotten we bought on a roadside where peaches tasted like sunshine. But tucked beneath was a single envelope with my name in Evelyn's square. Patient hand, the handwriting of a woman who believed clarity was a form of love. I slid the letter free and read until her voice was in the room again. She wrote that the pressure would come disguised as kindness, that invitations would turn into instructions, that the people who loved me would sometimes choose control because control feels safer than grief. She asked me, almost like a dare, to remember who fixed the leaky roof, who balanced the budget, who stood in the yard after every storm and counted shingles, and to act like that man. There were no sermons, just sentences with spine. Keep the house if it keeps you whole. Don't let anyone rent your future by the month. When you're tired, choose small, right things instead of big, impulsive ones. And at the bottom, in a line that steadied me more than anything else on the page, she wrote, "Your dignity is not a negotiation." I set the letter beside the legal pad from yesterday, and for a moment, the air tasted sharper, like the instant before rain. Under the letter sat a thin stack of papers that explained why she'd never worried aloud about making ends meet. A modest life insurance rider I hadn't noticed before, one beneficiary only, Maya, written as cleanly as a lighthouse on a map. Not a fortune, just a light pointed in the right direction. There were also photocopies of the deed and a note in the margin in her tidy print. File where paper can hear itself. I smiled at that. The way she treated documents like tools, not trophies. Near noon, with the house settled and the coffee finally finished, I did what her letter asked, without saying the words twice. I took out a small digital recorder from the junk drawer, checked the battery, and left it on the counter where the red dot would be honest if it needed to be. I created a notebook just for this. Dates, names, what was said, what was promised. Because judges, like gardens, prefer regular watering. I added Peter Avery's copies to my bottom desk drawer and put a cheap fireproof safe under the stairs with duplicates. Not because I doubted my children, but because rumors about property move faster than apologies. When the clock nudged past early afternoon, the phone began its familiar campaign. Caleb with a message about making things easy. Jenna with an offer to stop by just to chat. Claire with a text that read, "Only, can we talk?" And I wrote their attempts down without answering. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing the time on purpose. I walked the rooms while the winter sun slid sideways, touching the chair where Evelyn read, the shelf where her penciled margins still look like trail markers through books we never finished, the lighthouse magnet that keeps Maya's crayon garden in place on the fridge. And I realized the house had stopped feeling like a stage and started feeling like a witness again. Back at the desk, I read the letter once more, slower, and noticed a postscript I'd missed in my first rush. When you feel cornered, widen the room. Call who steadies you. Document what matters. And let silence do some of the work. So I widened it. Emailed Peter a clean summary of every call and text since the funeral. Asked him to route all communication through his office and set my voicemail to say that legal correspondence belongs with counsel, somewhere close to late afternoon. When the light thins and the day starts admitting it can't be everywhere at once, I copied Evelyn's line in my own hand at the top of the pad. Your dignity is not a negotiation. And under it, I wrote 3 smaller right things I could do before dark. Change the deadbolt, label the envelopes for returns, and breathe. I did each in order, the way a man who's rebuilt a fence, one post at a time, knows to trust sequence. When I finished, the house felt less like a place I might lose and more like a place I had, by action and intention, already chosen. I placed Evelyn's letter back in its envelope, set it where my keys sleep, and stood still long enough to feel the difference between being alone and being left. By the time the first porch lights blinked on down the block, I knew tomorrow would ask for a bolder move. Tonight, it was enough to have found her voice and let it give mine its backbone back. They arrived unannounced in the kind of early morning that still tastes like coffee, tires whispering over the gravel before the birds had made up their minds about a song. And by the time the doorbell finished, its first long breath, I already knew the shape of the conversation. Caleb stood on the porch with his shoulders set, too persuasive. Jenna at his side, holding a manila folder like a bouquet with a job to do. And behind them, the street kept its pale hush as if it didn't want to be quoted. I opened the door just wide enough for weather and courtesy. "We thought we'd catch you," he said, stepping one foot over the threshold, the way people do when they're certain they belong. "This won't take long." He said long like a promise and a threat. I let the door stay where it was and asked if they wanted tea. Jenna smiled with a brightness that worked best on other people's parents. "We brought something," she said, tilting the folder. At the kitchen table, the light fell clean across the wood, and the little digital recorder I'd set there the night before looked like nothing until you knew what the red dot meant. I set 2 cups down, then placed a single sheet in the center of the table. Block letters I had rehearsed until they lost their sting and kept their steel. Any discussion about the property will be in writing and handled by counsel. Caleb glanced at it the way a runner looks at a headwind. "We have an offer," he said, sliding out a letter with numbers that wanted to be inevitable. "Above market. They understand. This is delicate. You could downsize. We'd outfit the basement. Your own entrance. A full bath. We can add a kitchenette. Independence. With a leash. tucked in the drawer. I kept my hands flat on the wood. I appreciate the legwork, I said, and let the sentence stop before it volunteered anything else. Jenna leaned in, palms soft on the table's edge. We're just trying to keep you safe, she said. And the word safe did what it always does when someone wants the keys. I slid a second page forward. Peter Avery's letter with its quiet barbed wire. Cease solicitation. Future contact in writing. No agency granted. Counsel will handle communications, I said, hearing how calm sounded when it had a job. Caleb pressed his thumb into the offer letter until the paper bent. You won't even look. I've looked at my life, I answered, and it fits this house. He laughed once, low and disbelieving. Dad, be reasonable. Reasonable, I said, isn't the same as convenient. Silence walked a slow circle around the table. Jenna tried a new door. Maya's tuition keeps getting closer, she offered gently, turning the sentence so it flashed like a coin in light. You've been generous. This would make it simpler. I thought of the envelopes mailed in quiet months, and the small policy Evelyn had pointed like a lighthouse toward the right generation. Maya will be fine, I said, not loud, just final. Caleb shifted tactics the way weather does when it realizes you've brought a coat. We can't keep doing this, he said. The taxes, the maintenance, the ownership, I said, and let the last word land with its own weight. He reached for the manila folder again, as if a second pass at the numbers might change my deed. At least sign a letter of intent, he said. Non-binding. Then it won't mind being unsigned, I said. The red dot on the recorder kept breathing. Jenna noticed it, and her voice thinned. Are you recording us? I'm preserving accuracy, I answered, so nobody forgets what was offered and what was refused. She sat back, not angry, so much as surprised by the absence of a softer surface to land on. Caleb tapped the table, a quick, bright staccato that used to mean he was out of patience with long division. You're being difficult to make a point. Some points need making, I said, like who decides where I sleep. He started to say conservatorship and thought better of it halfway through, the word catching on his teeth and choosing a different disguise. People go through changes. He tried. Judges understand when families have to step in. Judges also understand deeds and competence, I said, sliding a third page toward him. The county stamp on Peter's filing that read like a locked door. If you're worried about me, ask me to dinner on Sunday. And don't bring paperwork. Ask about the garden. Tell me about your week. That's what worry sounds like when it's love. The room went quiet enough to hear the clock in Evelyn's study measure our breaths. Jenna was the first to find a new sentence. Could we at least take copies for our attorney? The we landed differently this time. Smaller, less certain. I handed her duplicates from the binder labeled House. Facts, because paper travels better than outrage. Caleb gathered the pages with a care he mistook for control. This isn't over, he said, but it came out more like a hope than a verdict. For now, it is, I answered, standing. Meetings end when a man decides to stand. On their way to the door, Jenna paused at the refrigerator and noticed the lighthouse magnet holding Maya's crayon garden in place. She drew that the last time you watched her, she said, softer. She told me you said to draw what's true. I did, I said, and I meant it. The porch let in a stripe of cool air as they stepped outside, the light already angling toward late morning. And when the door settled back into its frame, the house breathed with me. I clicked the recorder off, printed a quick summary for Peter, with the time, the offer, the tone, and sent it from the P.O. box address I'd started using for anything that needed to be dull and undeniable. The cups on the table had gone lukewarm, but the tea still did what it's supposed to. It steadied the hands that held it. I stood at the window and watched the rosemary lean into the path, like it knew which way this story would move next. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not just defended, but directed. By the time the light slid to mid-afternoon and the house had cooled from their visit, I knew the next right thing was labor, not argument. So I took the binder marked house, facts off the table, set it where my keys sleep, and pulled a stack of flattened boxes from the garage, the kind that still remember other people's moves. With a blue marker, I printed in neat block letters, Caleb, return, Claire, return, and set each box in the middle of a room, like a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. I didn't pack yet. I staged because a carpenter lays out tools before the first cut, and a boundary deserves the same ceremony. Then I called the moving company a neighbor swears by, and a man named Rodriguez answered in a voice that sounded like he had lifted more lives than he's been given credit for. We spoke in specifics. 2 stops, first to Caleb's, then to Claire's, delivery to the door, a polite request for signatures, and if anyone refused, time-stamped photos would do the talking. He offered a window just after sunrise, and I said I wanted the first slice of morning, the hour when certainty runs ahead of second thoughts. After we hung up, I wrote the plan, longhand, the way Evelyn taught me to write recipes. Measurements, heat, timing. Then emailed Peter Avery a heads up, so the day's shape would already exist in someone else's calendar. Boxes returned to original owners, no confrontation intended, documentation to follow. I taped the recorder's spare battery to its underside, changed the greeting on my phone, so anything about the property routes to council, and switched the ringer to a setting that feels like breathing rather than alarm. In the guest room closet, I found the boyhood things that had been sleeping in my house under the fiction of nostalgia. Caleb's stiff leather jacket from a decade when mirrors did most of his talking, the binder of baseball cards that once promised to pay for college if luck behaved, the stack of yearbooks whose captions were sweeter than the choices that followed. Into Claire's box went the piano books, with corners worn raw by ambition that never learned endurance, the ceramic bowl she made in college that I kept because it remembered her better than she remembered herself, the printed essay from middle school where she wrote about wanting to be the person who brings something to the table. On top of each stack, I placed a single sentence on heavy paper. I'm returning what belongs to you. I'm keeping what belongs to me. Not a threat, just a label the world could read without squinting. Somewhere near early evening, I stepped outside to the side yard where the rosemary edges the brick and cut a handful, crushing a sprig between my fingers until the air smelled like all the Sundays Evelyn made feel earned. Grief tried to use that smell to write a softer story, but I told it the truth. Love is not a reason to ignore the locks on your own doors. Back inside, I tightened the hinge on the back gate and swapped the flimsy screws on the strike plate for the solid ones I should have used years ago. Small work that felt like closing daylight at the seams. I took a beat at the refrigerator and pressed Maya's crayon garden more firmly beneath the lighthouse magnet, telling the drawing, quietly, that it was one of the few things allowed to travel between my house and my heart without paperwork. Then I laid out tomorrow's kit on the kitchen table like a surgeon before dawn. Envelopes with delivery addresses printed in careful letters, a roll of tape, a black marker, 2 copies of Peter's cease solicitation letter, Rodriguez's card, and the list that steadies me. Load, confirm, deliver, document, send to council. As the sky sank toward that hour when porch lights admit defeat, I brewed tea and walked the rooms one more time, putting a hand on the places that still answered to me. Evelyn's chair, the banister. We tightened every other Thanksgiving. The clock in her study that refuses to hurry and therefore tells the truth. When I passed the front door, I slid a fresh envelope through the slot addressed to myself at the P.O. box, a small rehearsal for the way I intend certain conversations to travel from now on. Dull, trackable, polite. Close to nightfall, I sat at the table and rewrote tomorrow on a single index card. Be early, be courteous, be finished, and tucked it into my wallet behind the folded line I keep there for ballast. Any discussion about the property will be in writing and handled by counsel. Before turning out the lights, I stood by the window and watched the street settle, that blue hush that belongs to neighborhoods that still believe morning can fix things, and I felt it. The clean, quiet click of a man preparing his border not to keep love out, but to make sure it comes to the right door. Just after sunrise, when the street was still a hush of porch lights blinking themselves out, and the air tasted faintly of metal and dew, the white truck eased to the curb and sighed as if it understood the assignment. Rodriguez climbed down with two men in wool caps, shook my hand with that unhurried steadiness of people who work with weight for a living, and listened while I went over the plan one last time. 2 stops, Caleb first, then Claire. Deliver to the door. Collect signatures where possible. If not, time-stamped photos. Send me everything. He repeated each step back the way good carpenters do, and I felt the day slide into its groove. We moved through the rooms without ceremony, the boxes already labeled like sentences waiting for their periods. Caleb, return. Claire, return. My neat block print doing the quiet work of a boundary. The jacket that tried too hard. The yearbooks that loved a version of the future that never arrived. The binder of baseball cards that promised to finance a dream luck never interviewed. The piano books with the chewed corners of ambition. The clay bowl from a semester when Claire thought praise could teach fingers what practice refused to do. I set a single line on top of each stack, thick cardstock, no flourish. I'm returning what belongs to you. I'm keeping what belongs to me. Rodriguez asked if anything else needed a softer hand, and I nodded toward the refrigerator. He smiled when he saw Maya's crayon garden pinned by the lighthouse magnet, and said he had a granddaughter who draws skies too big for the paper. It's a relief to be understood by a stranger without having to fill out a form. They worked quickly, efficiently, the dollies whispering over old wood. And by the time the sun had lifted enough to find the top half of the windows, we were rolling the last box toward the door. I signed Rodriguez's inventory, print and signature, the ink dragging across the carbon like a zipper, and watched the truck swallow the morning's decisions. When it pulled away, the house breathed in a way I hadn't heard since the funeral. Not empty, not lonely, just accurate. I set the recorder on the table, red dot ready, not for theater but for memory, and poured coffee that I actually drank this time. Half an hour later, my phone thumped with the first photo. Caleb's front steps, boxes squared and bright in the winter light, my single sentence visible like a spine. Beneath it, the neat little check mark that means a signature had been obtained. 4 minutes after that, another image. Claire's stoop. The piano bench returned to its rightful gravity. The clay bowl wrapped and nested with care. The reflection of a woman in the storm door, just beyond frame. The caption was a time and nothing more. I forwarded both to Peter with a short note. Deliveries completed. Documentation attached. No incident. He replied with his favorite verb, logged, proof that even quiet victories can have a ledger. The house felt taller, without the unclaimed past in its closets. I did small work, the kind that keeps a day from turning into a courtroom in your head. Tightened the hinge that had been complaining near the pantry. Swapped tired screws in the back gate for ones that could be trusted. Wiped the faint cardboard scuffs from the hall table until the wood remembered its own face. Outside, the rosemary leaned into the brick, the way it does when the sun agrees with it. I pinched a sprig and rolled it between my fingers, then set it by the sink where its clean, stubborn smell could keep me honest. A text came through. Caleb, we need to talk. And I put the phone face down, not as punishment, as punctuation. There's a difference, and it matters. Close to mid-morning, the truck returned with Rodriguez's second ritual. 2 signed slips, 2 additional photos, and a short message that read like competence distilled. Both delivered, both acknowledged. Let me know if you need anything else. I thanked him the way men thank other men when the job is done without theater, then slid the slips into the binder labeled House Facts, a place where paper can hear itself. For a moment, I stood at the window and looked at the lemon tree flicking light across the glass and thought about the word petty, how people use it when precision makes them nervous. And I said out loud to the rosemary and to the empty room, and maybe to Evelyn, wherever she was listening, that this was not pettiness. It was repair, of boundaries, of rooms, of the shape of my own life. The doorbell did not ring right then, but the neighborhood took a breath like it might, and I felt ready for whatever walked up the steps next, not because I wanted a fight, but because I had finally arranged the house to tell the truth, even if I didn't say a word. He came just after lunch, the kind of early afternoon when the light goes long across the hallway and a doorbell sounds like it expects results. And when I opened to the length of the chain, I could already see the argument riding on Caleb's shoulders. He held his phone up, so the photo of his front steps, my boxes, my sentence, filled the gap between us, and he asked what I thought I was doing, as if possession were a confession. Returning what's yours, I said, and let the stillness do half the work. He pushed his palm against the door, the way he used to push a chess piece when he'd run out of moves he liked. This is petty, he said. This is precise, I answered. There's a difference. He wanted inside. I unhooked the chain only after I set the terms. No paperwork, no talk of buyers, no surprises, and led him to the kitchen where the little recorder sat with its red dot asleep and the binder labeled House. Fax waited like a witness who doesn't mind being sworn. He didn't sit. He paced the rug twice and then planted both hands on the table. We have a stronger offer, he said, and his voice tried for calm and landed on urgency. You can't keep this up. Taxes, maintenance, your safety. My safety doesn't live in your basement, I said. It lives in my decisions. He gave a short laugh that didn't trust itself. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Hard isn't the same as wrong, I said, and slid Peter Avery's stamped notice to the edge of the wood, so his eyes had to jump from his idea of the future to the county's idea of the present. He didn't touch the paper. Jenna says you're recording us. I'm preserving accuracy, I said. Mouths forget, paper remembers. He shifted, recalculating, and tried the word that thinks it's compassion when it's really custody. Families step in when people change. People change, I agreed, but not always in the direction you're betting on. If you're worried about me, ask me to dinner on Sunday. Don't bring a folder. Bring your week. That landed somewhere he didn't plan to stand. He moved to a new tactic, softer. Maya's watching all of this, he said, and I felt the tug that sentence was designed to pull. Then let her watch a man keep what's his without taking what isn't, I said. He exhaled hard, the way men do when the truth won't take their shape. You've been sending her money. It wasn't a question. Quietly, I said, because education is a promise, not a performance. He looked at the lemons in the bowl, like they were refusing to be on his side. So that's it. You keep the house. We just stand back. You keep your life, I said, and pointed to the door, not to end the conversation, but to frame it. You keep your boxes. You keep your choices. I keep my roof and my pen. When you want to talk about the garden, or your swing, or that project at work, you pretend not to care about. I'm here. When you want to talk square footage, my attorney's address is on the letter you didn't pick up. Something in him softened and then bristled, like a tide rethinking the shore. You really think you can just say no? I already did, I said, and the red dot blinked awake because the room had earned it. He stared at the recorder, the way a boy stares at a scoreboard that doesn't understand what he meant to do. You'll regret this, he said, and the threat sounded tired, even as it stood up straight. If I do, I'll regret it under my own ceiling, I answered. He looked as if he wanted to slam a door that wasn't yet open, so I saved us both and walked him to it. On the threshold, he paused at Maya's crayon garden, the lighthouse magnet holding the paper steady against the hum of the fridge. She drew that for you, he said, trying one last time to borrow her light. She drew what's true, I said, and opened the door the rest of the way. The porch held a thin band of brightness. He stepped into it and down the stairs without turning back. When the house settled into its own silence again, I clicked the recorder off, wrote a clean paragraph for Peter. Visit, tone, phrases used, no escalation, and tucked it into the binder where paper can hear itself. I tightened the lid on the marker, set it beside the lemons, and stood a moment at the window while the rosemary leaned toward the brick, as if the plant knew which way dignity grows. The phone started to vibrate across the counter. Unknown number first, then Claire's name blinking after it, and I let it ring once longer than habit before I reached for the call I was willing to take. I let the unknown number fade and took Claire's call. The line opening into that brittle quiet you get when someone has rehearsed a speech and still doesn't know where to put the first word. And then it came. Why would you send my things like that? As if the boxes had insulted her instead of merely arriving in their own names. I stood at the kitchen window where the light goes long in early afternoon and answered the only way I know how when shame is trying to dress up as outrage. Because they're yours, I said, and kept my voice even. And I'm done storing what belongs to other people. She talked fast, tripping over the embarrassment, neighbors, the photo on her phone, the piano books perched on the bench like a dare. And underneath the speed, I heard the hurt of a daughter who believed proximity was the same as permission. I let her finish. Then I told her about the boxes I labeled before the movers ever lifted them, about the sentence I put on top in thick cardstock so nobody had to squint. I'm returning what belongs to you. I'm keeping what belongs to me. That's cruel, she said, softly now, as if cruelty were a style of handwriting, and I felt the old reflex to pad the truth, flick its tail, and run. No, I said, it's geometry. Boundaries aren't fences that keep love out. They're lines that stop people from mistaking access for affection. She went quiet the way a room does when the air changes, then tried a smaller door. Maya asked why her piano books were on my porch. She said, what was I supposed to tell her? I touched the lighthouse magnet, that holds Maya's crayon garden to the fridge and thought about that bright square of truth. Tell her the books went home, I said. Tell her finishing matters more than starting pretty. Pick one song and carry it all the way to the last bar. And when your hands want to quit, let the want be louder. Claire made a sound that wasn't agreement and wasn't refusal. Just a person setting down a box she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Then she asked if I was trying to punish her for siding with Caleb. And I told her, punishment is noisy, and this was the opposite. That quiet is what happens when you return weight to the people strong enough to carry it. She said I was choosing paper over family, and I answered the way Evelyn taught me to answer when words start auditioning for jobs they can't do. Paper holds a boundary when a mouth won't, I said. It keeps love from getting mugged by a moment. She shifted, and I could feel the room she was in get a little larger, even from here. Do you really need all that? She asked, meaning the binder labeled House Facts, the letters with county stamps, the habit I've made of writing what was said and when. I need enough, I said, enough to keep us honest when we forget our own edits. She breathed out, and I heard edge give way to gravity. I didn't know you were sending Maya money, she said, not accusatory this time, almost like she was turning a photo to see it better. You weren't supposed to, I said. Gifts don't work if the invoice comes attached. Another small pause, and then the sentence I'd been waiting for all day. What do you want from me? It arrived without armor, and because of that, I put down mine. Keep what's yours, I said. Stop asking other people to hold it for you. When you want to bring something to the table, start by carrying your own to it. She made a sound that could have been a laugh if it hadn't been a memory. Middle school, the essay about wanting to be the person who brings things. And I let that recognition do work I couldn't. Are we going to see you? She asked. And there was the daughter again, not the shareholder. Ask me on a Sunday, I said. Ask for pie, not paperwork. Tell me about your week. I'll tell you what the garden is doing. The quiet on the line this time wasn't brittle. It held. Pie, she echoed, as if tasting the word for vitamins. All right. She didn't apologize, and I didn't ask her to. We said goodbye like people who had decided to walk instead of push. When the call ended, I wrote a clean paragraph for Peter. Tone calmed, no threats, boundaries stated, and slid it into the binder where paper can hear itself. I rinsed a cup and set it upside down to dry, the rosemary on my fingers giving off that honest green that refuses to negotiate with moods. Outside, the lemon tree flicked light across the glass, like it had learned a new language and wanted to try a sentence. And inside, the clock in Evelyn's study kept time the way it always has, without hurrying, without asking permission. I pressed the lighthouse magnet one notch higher, because a small square of truth deserves the firmest hold, and felt the house answer back, not with applause, just with accuracy. Caleb would circle. The realtor would sigh. Papers would arrive, wearing their little barcodes, but the map had changed. My boxes had gone home. My roof had chosen me back. And my daughter, for the first time in a long time, hadn't asked for a key. She'd asked for pie. By late morning, the house had the tidy alertness of a room waiting to be quoted. And I set the kitchen table the way you set a stage for truth. 2 heavy mugs. The binder labeled House Facts. Peter Avery's letters with their green stamps clipped on, and the little recorder asleep at the center, like a red-eyed cricket that sings only when asked. Peter arrived a shade early, as he always does, suit the color of decisions, and he wrote the date on his legal pad in a hand that makes clerks relax. A few breaths later, Caleb came in with Jenna beside him and their attorney. a careful man who introduced himself as Jeff, and Claire followed with her coat still on, as if she wanted to keep an exit close. Jeff opened with the voice of a professional, hired to make weather sound like a calendar. Good faith. Practical options. A path that honors everyone. While Peter slid the cease solicitation and notice of non-representation across the woods so quietly they sounded like facts finding their chairs. No agency has been granted, Peter said, not unkindly, and any attempted listing or buyer contact belongs in writing to counsel. And the words landed without drama because paper knows how to do its job. Caleb lifted a folder as if elevation could change its contents and talked about a stronger offer, about my safety, about maintenance, as if gutters and grief shared a ledger. And I let him finish before I set a single page in my block handwriting where it could be read without asking permission. 1. I am not selling my home. 2. If I choose to relocate, you will hear it from me after the decision is made. 3. Support for Maya remains direct and at my discretion. Jenna touched the list with 2 fingers like it might be warm, and then tried a softer route, saying they only wanted what was best, and that families step in when seasons change. Peter's pen didn't move. If anyone has suggested conservatorship, he said in the tone people use to lift a bruise and see if it still hurts, know that competence is established by fact, not feeling. We have recordings, time-stamped communications, paid taxes, and a clean deed. The room quieted the way rooms do when the wind leaves, and you realize it was holding the door shut. Jeff recalibrated to compromise, and timelines, and letters of intent that don't bind until they do. And I answered the way a man answers when he's learned to trust sequence. Any proposal belongs with my attorney. If you want to know how I'm doing, ask me to dinner on Sunday. Bring a story, not a signature page. Caleb called me unreasonable, which is what people say when no stops being a phase. And Claire stared at the lemons in the bowl like they might explain me, then looked up and asked the only honest question in the room. What do you want us to learn? It arrived without armor, so I set mine down too. Keep what's yours. I said, stop confusing access with love. If you want to bring something to the table, start by carrying your own to it. She didn't answer, but the quiet changed shape. Jenna recovered first and asked if they could at least take copies for their counsel. I handed over duplicates from house. Facts, because outrage travels poorly and paper doesn't. Jeff gathered them with a practiced nod that admitted defeat without naming it, and Caleb, needing one last line, said, "This isn't over," but his voice made it sound like hope instead of threat. "For today, it is," I said, "standing because meetings end when a man decides to stand." At the door, Jenna paused at the refrigerator where the lighthouse magnet holds Maya's crayon garden straight against the hum and said softly, "She drew that for you." And I told her what I tell Maya. She drew what's true. The porch gave back a slice of winter light as they left, and when the door settled into its frame, the house exhaled with me. I clicked the recorder on, long enough to read a clean summary into its memory. Who came? What was said? Which words tried on disguises? And then sent Peter a short note from the P. Oh, box address he prefers. Meeting concluded. No agreements. Boundaries affirmed. He replied with a single word. He knows I trust. Logged. Proof that even a quiet line drawn in daylight can earn a ledger entry. I rinsed the mugs, set them upside down to dry, and pressed the magnet a notch higher so the drawing wouldn't slip. Outside, the rosemary leaned into the brick, as if it knew which way dignity grows. And inside the clock in Evelyn's study kept time without asking for anyone's permission, which is all I wanted from the rest of the day. The envelope waited at the post office box like a brick wrapped in manners, heavy enough to tilt the day, and when I slid it open in the truck, the foreign stamps made the dashboard look like a shoreline. Inside were confirmations in crisp ink. Title recognized. My standing formal. An authorization for a caretaker named Anna to prepare the house overseas as instructed. And the clarity of it steadied me more than any sermon. I drove home slower than habit and set the envelope beside the binder labeled house. Facts. As if tools worked better in pairs. Then pulled the small suitcase that always tells the truth from the hall closet and laid out what a man needs when he's done auditioning for other people. 2 shirts that don't bargain, socks that know their work. The sandalwood kit Evelyn liked, because it made mornings behave. The passport, a thin folder of duplicates, the little recorder, and Maya's crayon garden slipped under the zipper, like a permission slip, signed by color. By early afternoon, I walked the rooms, with a hand on the wood, the way a carpenter checks a frame. Evelyn's chair, with its soft indent. The banister we tightened every other Thanksgiving. The clock in her study refusing to hurry and therefore telling the truth. And I wrote 2 brief notes in my neat block print, one for Caleb, one for Claire, both the same spine with different punctuation. I'm returning what's yours and keeping what's mine. Ask me for Sunday and pie when you want to talk about anything but square footage. I left them beneath the ledger where utilities live so the numbers could keep the peace. I texted Peter Avery that I'd be unreachable for a while and that all property matters should continue through him, then turned my voicemail into a short hallway that leads to his door. I walked next door and gave Joyce an envelope marked mail with the extra key taped inside. Asked her to slide anything official through the slot, and she nodded with the quiet competence of a person who understands the difference between private and secret. Back in the kitchen, I messaged Anna, flight set, arrival soon. Could she make the rooms breathe the way Evelyn liked? And her reply came almost at once. Linens fresh, windows cracked for salt air, a bowl of lemons within reach. Sometime toward late afternoon, I turned off the settings that announce your location, like a carnival barker, canceled the subscriptions that assumed residency in my pocket, and set the binder copies where a hand in a hurry could find them. I took one last slow lap as the light leaned long, pressed the lighthouse magnet 1 notch higher so Maya's drawing wouldn't slip, pinched a sprig of rosemary, and let its green honesty stay on my hands, checked the back gate, tightened a hinge that had been clearing its throat for years, and I stood in the doorway to Evelyn's study and said out loud that dignity is not a negotiation, and heard the room agree. Evening gathered itself in the windows, and I put the suitcase by the door and sat at the table for a minute that felt like a verdict, then sent a single message to the family thread without a city or a schedule. I am safe. I love you. I'll be in touch when I have a kitchen table that belongs to me. The ride to the airport came in that hour when streetlights blink on and drivers start counting tips. And when he asked business or pleasure, I said temperature. And we both laughed because the truth can be funny when it stops asking permission. The terminal had its usual choreography: belts and trays, shoes and gray bins, a boarding pass that behaved, and I moved through it with the patience of a man who has decided. At the gate, I opened the Lisbon packet one more time and touched the thick paper as if it were a railing on a high stair, then closed it and watched the runway lights write their measured script across the dark. Boarding came with the quiet shuffle of people who have their own maps to keep. And when the plane lifted, the city unstitched beneath us. Rivers like handwriting, neighborhoods like receipts. And the feeling wasn't triumph or escape so much as alignment, like a door meeting its frame without complaint. Somewhere above the clouds, I closed my eyes and let Evelyn's line take the front seat. Choose small right things in the order they deserve. And for the first time since we lowered her into the ground, I slept without bracing. Tomorrow, there would be keys that fit other locks, lemons in a white bowl, windows that remember how to be horizons, and a caretaker named Anna, who keeps houses breathing. But tonight, all I needed was the steady hum of an engine carrying a man who finally set his boundary and then walked through it.